Um, Welcome to the fourth weekly conversation of CHI Work, a symposium on human-computer interaction for work. Please note that this session is recorded. We only record people that are speaking. We have a code of conduct, which I think is already online. If not, it will be online soon. So maybe if you watch the video recording, it's online. Today we have Dr. Sarah Fox from Carnegie Mellon University with us as a guest. Before I introduce her, I will make a couple more general remarks about the series. In the CHI Work series, we have weekly conversations with experts on various aspects related to the future of work. The general chairs of CHI Work are Andrew Kuhn and Orit Shear, and the conversations are hosted by the technical program chairs, which are Anna Cox, Neha Kumar, Helena Mentis, and myself. We have a fantastic team of volunteers that help us create these sessions and do various aspects from the website to social media. You can find out more about them and about future CHI Work series on www.chiwork.org. The format of each session is that we have an informal conversation with a guest, today with Sarah, and that will go for about 30 minutes, which includes your questions as audience. Please write any questions that you have in the chats. We will monitor it and we will give the floor to you to ask it. My colleague Neha Kumar will join shortly and she will handle the Q&A. Once the conversation is finished, that first formal part, we will stop the recording and we will have time for more informal conversation. That's the general intro. Now the more important part to introduce Sarah Fox. We are honored to have you with us today. Sarah is an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, where she directs the Tech Solidarity Lab. Sarah's research focuses on how technological artifacts challenge or propagate social exclusions by examining existing systems and building alternatives. Her work has earned awards in leading computing venues like ACM, CSCW, CHI, and DIS. Sarah holds her PhD in human-centered design and engineering from the University of Washington. And prior to joining CMU, she was a postdoctoral scholar at the Department of Communication and the Design Lab at the University of California in San Diego. And she's worked in design research at Microsoft Research, Google, and Intel Labs. In short, she's already seen a lot and brings in a great experience to today's conversation. And I encourage you to check out her website to see even more. Welcome, Sarah. Today we are going to talk about worker-centered design, and you've recently been working on a couple of research projects that investigate this. But before we go into the specific projects, could you explain to us what is worker-centered design sort of in a nutshell?
Sure, yeah. Thank you for having me, and thanks so much for organizing this symposium. It's really exciting. I've been kind of following along. And I've loved the talk so far, and the ones to come in over the couple of weeks are extremely exciting. So yes, I'm Sarah Fox. I am from HCII and CMU in Pittsburgh, which if folks don't know, has a long kind of labor history that we could get into maybe in the informal conversation part of the day. But yeah, so one thing I've been kind of working through is this concept of worker-centered design along with colleagues through a number of different projects. But essentially it kind of builds on a legacy of participatory design that many of us probably know well, kind of emerging out of Scandinavia in the 1970s and early 80s, and really focusing on collaboration with labor unions. So kind of deeply political design activity. And really centering around the introduction of computing systems into the workplace for the first time, and how that shifts and displaces work. So in one example, the kind of graphic design workers union working with Pele N and colleagues through Project Utopia. So that's one kind of early example, and kind of leveraging organizational connections through labor unions and universities. So it really draws on that lineage, but at the same time learns from and extends more contemporary techniques that have been built up around community-driven design, community-led design, that might have been more neighborhood-based or issue-based. So the kind of contemporary state of art of PD and community-based design. And also kind of retracing those political roots. So in the United States, there's been, where I'm based, there has been a kind of resurgence of interest in worker advocacy generally, a slight rise in union membership over the past couple of years in particular. And it's something that you can kind of see in the labor and business press. It's kind of each week there's a new strike or there's a new vote for unionization. Here in Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh faculty actually just voted to join the United Steelworkers Union, which is a kind of big shift. So it's kind of connecting to that. And the general concept is, and the kind of ethos behind worker-centered design is that without frontline worker input, it is not possible to design kind of ethical, pragmatic, or purposeful technology. So that's the kind of main commitment and motivation behind the work.
Oops, sorry, I was finding my unmute button. That's really cool, and I think it helps to talk about a couple more of the concrete projects that you've been working on, so we get a better understanding of this working context. So we've had a very brief exchange about it, but I still need to learn a lot about it. So I'm excited that I get to learn today. Because one project that you've mentioned to me is called Unite Here, and it's with hospitality workers. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going on there? What was the setup of that study?
Yeah, so it's actually ongoing. We've been doing this project for a couple of years, and a lot of the beginning stages were just about building relationships. But more recently, we've run a number of workshops with hospitality workers, so including housekeepers, bartenders, cocktail servers, and then stadia workers. So folks who deliver food to seats and beers to seats in stadium across the United States, so baseball, football, all the kinds of sports. The Unite Here is actually one of the largest hospitality workers unions within North America, so Canada, United States, Mexico. So this is a collaboration between researchers and worker members of Unite Here and faculty, including Jody Ferlizzi, Chinmay Kulkarni, myself, and then others within the domain of tourism management, labor relations, and economics, feminist economics, and working together. So it's a deeply interdisciplinary project across institutions. So we're one facet. We would represent then the CMU's facet would focus in on technology, kind of interpreting the kind of hype cycle around technology within the hospitality sector, as well as design kind of interventions that might be more appropriate for the context, might again kind of take in worker voice along the way, you know, in the development phases rather than kind of as an add-on or as a band-aid after the fact. So this is what we've been working on. And just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we've been seeing with housekeepers who, housekeepers are folks who clean rooms in hotels. So they would be the ones who strip the beds and kind of tend to the vacuuming of floors, dusting, all the kind of sanitation and disinfection that we really appreciate about hotels. So they're the ones who kind of go in and day out and do that really kind of laborious and intensive work, particularly during the pandemic. The standards around this are really intensified. So we chatted with them in the format of a workshop where we learned about the introduction of algorithmic management systems into their daily work. And so algorithmic management systems in this context largely dictate scheduling and sequencing of tasks. So for housekeepers, it's really centered around the sequences of rooms that you might address. Historically, this would have been done manually by a supervisor or manager on paper. And you might take into account worker preferences or, you know, the number, a lot of times the number of rooms that you do in a day is actually decided at the contract stage. So it's, you know, the union is bargaining around this, and so you can't go beyond X number of rooms in a day without it being kind of, you know, overtime. So, you know, this is something that is spelled out really concretely within the sites that we're working with. And with the introduction of algorithmic management systems, some of this gets blurred or complicated. So housekeepers have told us that they are being assigned more rooms than they're supposed to be, for one, or that the sequences of rooms that they are given is just all over the place. So rather than getting rooms on a single block, just a single hallway, they might get a room up on the 3rd floor and then down again on the 1st floor and then all the way up on the 15th floor and then down again. And you kind of get the point where you would have to be pushing your 300-pound cart up and down the hall into the elevator, wait, you know, take it up again, down. And previously, they kind of had a bit of discretion, and they were able to kind of, obviously, we all have preferences about how we do tasks in our daily lives. So we might take on an hour worth of email and get that out of the way and not look at email for a while, for example. So housekeepers told us that they really, many of them like to say, strip all the beds on a block and then vacuum each room and then maybe address cleaning a bathroom. So, you know, kind of, and that's what they found to be most efficient for them, or less kind of intensive on their bodies. But if you're going up and down and around and all over, you don't have the kind of flexibility to do that anymore. So it has a lot of kind of downstream effects, even though the system is essentially optimizing for the kind of elite user, so the people who want to check in early and have a certain number of points with the hotel and so on and so forth. But likely it's just essentially an oversight on the part of the developers. So they didn't really think about what would happen on the ground. And they likely did not, say, do ethnographic research, understanding housekeeping work and so on and so forth. So that's one example that we've heard about. And this can lead to kind of physical effects. This can lead to repetitive stress injuries. This can lead to burnout. And again, like I mentioned before, especially with the intensification of work that has come on because of the pandemic, the stringent standards around cleaning and disinfection, and the reduction in labor. So a lot of housekeepers are furloughed or have been laid off. And in the United States, we've all heard at least about labor shortages. And so a lot of people aren't being hired back, or it's kind of slow to hire back. And so the people who are there are taking on a lot. So I'll kind of end with that, the kind of real physical, emotional, and mental stakes of this too.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I guess from the manager or the programmer of that software, it's just a variable in the software that's being manipulated. Like, oh, you need to do 4 rooms, and just when you're programming it, you don't understand the concept. Like, well, but it's going up the elevator, and small parameter changes can have big consequences. I'm wondering, how can researchers, companies tackle this better? So you've mentioned unions a couple of times, like that there's a lot of movement, that more people are joining unions. And I also thought you started with saying, well, the beginning of the project was a lot about building relationships, which is it's quite a big task of research that is often overlooked, right? So it's because it takes a while before you have their trust. So how can we make sure that the change happens? So does this have to go through unions? Do scientists need to talk about this more loudly? Where do you see the sort of the bigger movement going?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in our case, like I said, the kind of situational context of us being in a kind of labor town makes it possible, and that there is this kind of it is kind of in the air. But in collaborations I'm doing, I think we'll talk a little bit later about this, with folks at UT Austin, there isn't the kind of same association, and there isn't the kind of labor representation there. And so it's not possible everywhere, because union membership is not kind of wide across the United States. Generally, it is kind of more so in hospitality, but in other industries, not necessarily. So, so that is one thing, but there are kind of worker advocacy groups on the smaller scale that do operate pretty widely. So it might be a kind of smaller company-based group, or an organization and advocacy group or mutual aid group that might be local to the city that you're in, and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of mutual aid groups, for example, around service industry during the start of the pandemic, where a city would pool together funds to support bartenders and folks who worked at concert venues and restaurants and so on, to kind of get through the shutdown, the lockdown initially. So groups like that, I think, where the interest is really in kind of mutual worker support, might be an avenue for collaboration. With the Unite Here project, it was kind of a mutual interest among our organization and theirs. So it was kind of natural in coming together. One other thing,
I'm thinking in terms of time, because I want to make sure that, that we don't overrun too much, and that we keep enough time for the Q&A. So I wondered if maybe we can talk for a couple of minutes, and then we move on to the Q&A about. I mean, feel free to finish what you were about to start. Hopefully you said that. But if we could talk about the other project that you mentioned with University of Texas at Austin, about AI is introduced to safeguard during COVID public workers from sort of heightened possibilities of contamination. Well, then that introduction of automation creates friction with the workers who were already there. And I think that's a very, if we talk about future of work, that's a very relevant sort of change. So maybe, can you tell us in a couple of minutes what's going on in that project, and then we'll pick up the Q&A from the audience from there.
Yeah. Thanks. This project is one I'm really excited about as well. This is in collaboration with Samantha Shorey down at UT Austin, as the other PI, and then Esther Kang, who is a PhD student here, Estefania Rodriguez, and others. So when this project is really about kind of, at the start of the pandemic, we noticed that there was an kind of influx of AI and robotics technologies introduced to waste labor settings specifically. So this is defined as kind of critical, essential work sectors during the start of the pandemic. So in the case of our project up here in Pittsburgh, in the Mid-Atlantic region, it's focused on janitorial work. So again, kind of thinking about cleaning, disinfection, and so on of public space. And then in UT Austin in Texas, they are doing a project around recycling sorting. So they have examined kind of AI sorting machinery within recycling sorting facility there. So recycling of household waste became much more complicated during the pandemic. So previously you had a mix of office and household refuse waste. And office waste is much more easy to manage because it's like recyclable paper and so on and so forth. But when it's mixed with all our, food containers, whatever it may be, it becomes more complicated, more difficult. So there they experience intensification. I mentioned before, janitorial staff also experience intensification through, stringent standards. And at the start of the pandemic, we didn't know much about spread. The focus really was on surfaces. And so just constantly cleaning everywhere. And to kind of safeguard, and there have been automated floor cleaning robots and AI sorting machines for a long time, but the investment kind of went up by an enormous amount. I think there's an article I could track down and maybe kind of post alongside this recording that kind of gives us the percentages in the business press, but it is really high. And so that was something we were witnessing and observing. And so we observed the introduction of this technology within these sites. So for me and folks here at Pittsburgh, it was UV floor scrubbing robots, autonomous UV floor scrubbing robots. And one thing we found is there is an immense amount of calibration and repair that has to happen when the robotics technologies hit the ground, essentially. So to give a really concrete example, pun intended, the facilities where we were observing have tile floor. And you probably know from cleaning your own home that tile floor has variable amounts of grout, depending on the tile, depending on the size of tile. And so what would happen is the robot would leave trail of water behind because it would get trapped in the crevices of the grout. And that posed a slip and fall hazard, which would be a liability for the cleaning contract crew. So they essentially had to mop up behind the floor cleaning robot. So, not really serving it's the purpose, the purported purpose of the technology. So what the invention that they came up with, the innovation that they came up with is just removing water, so not filling it with water anymore, and instead allowing it to kind of go over with the UV light. So that was their kind of compromise for having it within their space without kind of adding on additional work, where they would be kind of having to watch it in their periphery, monitoring and cleaning up behind it. So that's just one example of kind of intensification, calibration, where the technology, when it meets the real world, it has to kind of acclimate and get adjusted to and be adapted to the physical and social environment. So there are a lot of also worries about displacement and kind of taking away jobs from workers there as well. So
that's a really interesting example, because it's almost the classical human automation scenario where some technique is introduced to reduce the labor you need to do, but instead someone needs to walk behind it with a mop to clean up the mess of the robot, which is of course, only creating more work. There's already some questions in the chat, I believe, and Nea has had a look at them. Nea, do we already have people that we can ask?
Yeah, so hi Sarah, first thank you
Hi.
for joining us. And there's a few people who joined a little bit later, and I also shared the link on Discord. So just for those of you who just joined, we're listening to Sarah Fox talk about her research on worker-centered design. And there's a couple of questions in the chat. So I also have one, but I'll wait for a bit. Let me begin with Isabel's question. So you mentioned a lot of your recent work has focused on community building. Can you discuss some strategies for building/maintaining relationships with the labor groups you work with to keep them engaged in your projects? And also, I just want to quickly mention, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you'd like, you can also raise your hand. So Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, this is a great question. In the projects that we've done, we've really kind of partnered with labor unions and janitorial, the janitorial contract company as collaborators. So they're involved in essentially kind of commenting on and kind of pushing us to revise, edit, like even our research protocol, like our interview protocol or our design activities. So for an example, we've recently, at 4 in the morning, I woke up to go to the janitorial facility and do some participatory activities. They start at 6 a.m. So we have to get up and meet them there. But one thing that a 3-hour workshop is not feasible, again, given the kind of exhaustion that they're experiencing, their time constraints. And so kind of fitting into a stand-up meeting that they have at the beginning of their shift with that activity, and ensuring that we're kind of our materials are pictorial and then also in textual so that people can approach them in a variety of different ways, and kind of thinking about best practices and implementation. So that's one way we've been doing that, and we worked in consultation with staff there to develop that approach, that design approach. And so it's frequently in kind of careful collaboration with members, staff members, and union leaders in some cases where there are unions present.
Sorry, I'm muted. There's also a follow-up question. I don't see Isabel on my screen, so I'm not sure if they're here. But the follow-up question was, can you talk about some of the design activities you believe have been successful in your previous work?
Okay, yeah. I'm pretty flexible in terms of design activities. You know, I've used kind of illustration and comics as a way to, as a kind of like interview probe in the past, and that's been really helpful. Again, just to kind of share a variety of kind of materials and get the conversation going. I've also, you know, developed technology as a kind of working prototype, like many of us do, again, to kind of spur conversation around what could be. So kind of potential technologies that could exist, and then kind of talking together about what would it mean, and how could it, you know, be different, and so on and so forth. So used a lot of ethnographically informed methods, research to design inquiry. I think whatever, essentially, I'm pretty flexible, honestly, like whatever works for the context, and it's really contextual. So.
Thank you. And I see one raised hand. So would you like to go next?
Thank you, Sarah. It was a really interesting talk, and I think I had also your talk at the Cambridge University as well. So I'd like to introduce myself. I am also doing the postdoc at the Cambridge University, and I'm working with a project that is Working Age for the well-being of the people. So it is particularly with the people who are above 45 years and they are in working environment. So I would like to have your perspective, particularly while you were designing robots in a working age or in a working environment. Do you also consider any psychological or the physiological factors that can impact on the workers in that environment, and how you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I would say we have collaborators for the project, the interdisciplinary project I mentioned before with hospitality workers. We have collaborators in labor relations, and so their some of their focus is actually on the kind of psychological effects of the introduction of technology, and what that does to worker voice, and again, kind of notions of autonomy, and so on. So that's more, I would say, their focus, and I love collaborations for that purpose. So yeah, I can reference you to their work if that would be helpful.
That would be nice, and I really appreciate that if you reference that as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next, let's take Max's question. Max, do you want to just read out your question?
Sure, I'll try and, yeah. So I was interested in the bit you were saying about the janitorial staff having to move around the building because the computer had optimized them into a way that wasn't actually good for human work. We saw some people in one of our projects were tracking themselves with Fitbits to try and demonstrate that their job was harder than other people's jobs, despite it being classified the same way by some sort of system. So I wonder whether you'd seen examples of this as well, where people were using technology to kind of fight against, you know, naive, simplistic choices of work from a system. Oh,
that's a great example. I would love to, if you could send me reference to that, I would love to see that.
I'm afraid it's only anecdotal at our end.
Okay.
Just while we were following a factory around.
Yeah. Yeah, we have seen like kind of counter-record keeping is what some people call it. They've taken up diary studies to, we're working on another project with bus operators, and they actually keep logs every day of what they do. And so if anything comes up, you know, a year from now, a year and a half from now, 3 years from now, where they get questioned on an incident, they can say, actually, I was not on the schedule that day, so it wasn't me. which has happened. So there's a lot of, I think, a lot of counter record keeping that happens across the sites that we've seen, which has been really interesting. And for the hospitality project, we did actually develop a bit of a little video that displayed this kind of up and down and around kind of frenetic random pattern that housekeepers were describing to us as a way to kind of show that back and say, is this what you experience, and so on. So I think there are some really interesting kind of methods for counter record keeping and kind of data collection that are really interesting. It's a really promising area, I think. And there are some worker organizations, worker groups that do this. One example that I've kind of referenced before is this group. I think they changed their name recently, but it was called Driver Seat, I think. And essentially they are rideshare drivers who created an app that collects this, essentially the same kind of route data that Uber and Lyft invisibilize, and then it becomes a record for their own advocacy, their own kind of negotiation that they can then share out.
Interesting, thank you. I'm going to look up counter record keeping. That's a good phrase.
Thank you, Sarah. So we do have a few questions. So I'm going to suggest that we do maybe one more in the recorded time, and then we can go into unrecorded time. So Azra, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for your talk. That was really interesting to hear about. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the race, gender, class dimensions of who gets to do tech design versus who's actually engaged in the work that the tech is targeting. Like you talked about housework, for instance, housekeeping. That's an incredibly racialized and gendered space. And I was also wondering that, in addition to supporting labor organizing, if there are ways that HCI researchers could be shaping the future of work in a way that's more equitable, given these race, gender, class dimensions.
Such good questions. Okay, I'm really excited that you asked. Yes, the kind of classed, gendered, and racialized dynamics of both housekeeping, hospitality work, and janitorial work, which are classified a bit differently within the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States. They're kind of two different sectors, but they're both increasingly, housekeeping has kind of always been largely made up of women of color, a lot of immigrants within the United States, first generation immigrants, and then janitorial staff increasingly since the 1980s has become more and more kind of women and more people of color. So it's definitely a part of that. And there has been in janitorial work, de-unionization. So fewer and fewer people have access to unions across the United States. Though, like I said, there are kind of more recent trends toward unionizing again. So worker power in those contexts has not, at least for the past few decades, been high. But historically, there has been movements around janitorial work, specifically justice for janitors, for example. And organizing contingents like that, the Service Worker Employees International Union as well, have kind of worked for a long time. And some of that is recognized within policy as well, more recent policy, the kind of popular infrastructure bill that's currently being debated and slimmed down. But this kind of a focus on service work has been something that has been talked about more recently. But yes, a lot of times the folks that are experiencing the the intensification of work, the kind of calibration and repair, kind of taking on all of this, especially during the pandemic, do not resemble the people that are designing the technologies. So these technologies emerge out of tech firms that, you know, might be centered in Silicon Valley, or in some cases, Las Vegas in the hospitality sector, largely made up of kind of white elite men. So I think that is it is an issue, and I think bringing kind of folks to the table, workers to the table, and also kind of pushing back on this notion that of kind of designing exclusively for customer experience. So that's something that we have seen in housekeeping, especially where you have this kind of prioritization of status, of kind of hotel point status. Like that's only kind of focused on the customer above anything else. There's essentially no other stakeholder considered at all. And we have been a bit in conversation with the tech firm that produces that particular technology, and they are open to it, or they are open to kind of hearing more about workers. I think it's essentially that they just didn't do it yet, which is disheartening, but hopefully there's some headway there that we can make. And I think you had a second question too, and I lost it.
I mean, maybe you can get to it after other people have had a
Okay.
chance to. But it was around like equitable futures of work.
Yeah, maybe maybe we can go into unrecorded time. I just wanted to, well, maybe we'll wait for the unrecorded. I had a question and was hoping to connect to Nupur Raval's work, because you talk about her work in your article, and I just wanted to say that she's going to be our speaker in 2 weeks. But let's go into unrecorded time now. And
yeah, maybe I
who's
say a
gonna-
couple more things to close it off. Thanks.
yeah,
Leah.
sure, go ahead.
I wrote down a couple of notes for us. Oh, my dog decided to bark in the background. I'm not sure if that's on the recording. First off, thanks, Sarah, and also for talking a bit longer on this recorded time, because it's a quite intense conversation for 35 to 40 minutes. So thanks for your time and the many insights you gave us on this worker-centered design. Hopefully you could still stick around for the informal conversation a bit. To close off, I wanted to say, please, if you are on Twitter, you can find us at the handle @WorkerCentered. Next week, Neha will host also another speaker, which is Bharat Raghavan from the University of Southern California, and he will be talking about computing within limits. Please note that next week is at a different time. It's 4:30 UTC. Also, some of the time zones are switching to winter time this weekend, so cross-check. The best way to have the right time is to add the event to your calendar. You can do that through our website. There you can also subscribe to receive emails where we don't try to spam you about once a week of what's the next conversation that's coming up. With that, thanks again, Sarah. I think, Nabil, we can stop the recording.